All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm going to chat to you just a little bit while people are still joining the call. And I do want to apologize in advance. My husband just decided to turn on the spin cycle. So now you all know that, in fact, I am not sitting in a beautiful garden, but I'm in my basement right next to my washing machine. So apologies in advance for that. I want to welcome all of you to Coffee with a Curator. And as many of you know, I'm Aaliyah Vinnick. I'm the events manager at the Science Museum of Minnesota. So first of all, thank you for your continued support of our mission to make science education accessible to everyone. As all of you who've been on the call before know, we're going to be running this program with a few different presenters. Actually, we really just have two today, and the best way to see them is by choosing the speaker view, which is in the upper right of your Zoom screen. And as always with Coffee with a Curator, we will have time for Q&A towards the conclusion of the program, so you can use your chat button, chat in the bottom of the screen to share your thoughts and questions, and I'll feed those over to our speakers. I also want to let you know that we'll use the chat today to share some additional resources and links that you can refer to after the call. So thank you for that. So today is September 30th. I cannot believe it's almost October. And this summer has been really exciting for me. I've been able to see friends and family that I haven't seen for some time, and really resume some level of routine and normalcy with vaccinations and some COVID restrictions lifting. However, I think we all share some unease and even some depression that's afflicted some of us during the pandemic. And that seems to persist in some situations now with all the uncertainty that we're all kind of dealing with. And as some observers have noted, we were languishing without social contact, but we aren't quite yet flourishing in this new time. Social anxiety is real and understandable, and I'm sure you all agree that science can help us to understand the cognitive, behavioral, and emotional aspects of our collective post-pandemic mental health. Some of you might remember our Mind Matters exhibit, and that helped many of us at the Science Museum to find the language to discuss the topic of mental health. And I've asked that exhibit's project leader, Carrie Dwyer, who is one of two Carries speaking today, to join us to introduce our program. So Carrie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Aaliyah. Good morning, everybody. I'm Carrie Dwyer. I'm the Director of Exhibit Project Management at the Science Museum of Minnesota. And I, as Aaliyah said, got to work on our Mental Health Mind Matters exhibit. It was originally created by Curator, the Finnish Science Center, just outside Helsinki. But we partnered with them to modify it for a North American audience. And some of you may recall the exhibit opened here, seems like a lifetime ago, in May of 2018, and has been touring since it left SMM in 2019. It's been to the Iowa Science Center in Des Moines, the Science Center of Virginia in Richmond, the Montreal Science Center, not very far away at the Rochester Art Center, much closer to home. And then it just opened at the Fort Collins Museum of Discovery in Colorado. So it's really, it's been traveling. It was obviously paused during the critical point of the pandemic, and is just reopening again in Colorado. So the main idea behind the exhibition is that good mental health is an important aspect of everyone's life. And it's certainly something that we've thought a lot about over the last 18 months or so. We've talked amongst ourselves, colleagues at the museum. I think Lori Fink, who I see on this call, our director of science, has encouraged us to write about, kind of share the resources from that exhibit and talk about it, because we really wish we were hosting the exhibit, because so much of it let us explore kind of how we identify and express our emotions, how we cope with what's going on in our lives, and in an effort to kind of better understand ourselves and others, which is something obviously we've all struggled to do over the last year and a half. So there are some interactives in the exhibit. Let us think about how activities like painting or writing can help us express those emotions and strengthen our mental health. We've also, I think, continued to draw on some of the resources that we have in the exhibit, books and well, certainly books that have helped me talk with my teens during the last year about dealing with symptoms of depression when you're a teenager quarantined with your parents, you know, just trying to get through some of the emotions that we've all dealt with over the last I'm saying 18 months, it feels like more than that. So anyway, even though it's been a few years since we hosted the exhibit, it's really, the pandemic has really prompted us to revisit some of the ideas and programming we shared during the exhibit. And as Aaliyah said, we'll share some of those resources at the end. And I even, you know, reached out to our guests today, last spring, a year ago last spring, to talk about how mental health, how, you know, really how much talk about mental health had been, that the pandemic spurred, and asked for ideas from her for things we can all try to do to strengthen our mental health. So we thought it would be really good to check in with her again. As many of us, this is sort of just an ongoing, evolving situation that, you know, we're adjusting to getting back to work, school, more in-person socializing, and kind of give you a chance to tap into Carrie's expertise. So she's the real Carrie who's presenting today. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Carrie Michaels. She is a master of public health. She's an extension educator with the Center for Family Development at the University of Minnesota. She's a public health educator who works in partnership with leaders across campuses and community organizations to promote mental well-being. She serves as editor of the Children's Mental Health e-Review, which is an online publication that features current research and its implications for practice within varied settings. She promotes socio-ecological and interdisciplinary approaches to mental well-being in children, youth, and families. And together with those community and campus partners and colleagues, she develops educational tools, does training events, and develops long-term partnerships that really address social determinants of health. So with that, I'll turn it over to Carrie. Carrie, thank you so much for joining us today. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Carrie and Aaliyah, for inviting me here today. And thanks to all of you for joining. And first, congratulations on taking some time to focus on your own mental well-being. It's not something that many of us do easily. And so I appreciate that you're all here, and I'm looking forward to talking about mental wellness and how to take care of ourselves for a little bit of time. This has been a critical area of my work for these past 18 months. We are, I think, coming into our own in this field of mental well-being. There's a lot of discussion, at least in Minnesota at a state level, about what we're doing to have a statewide plan to promote mental well-being. And then individually, this topic is just on the table for many more of us than before this pandemic. So I'm glad to be able to talk about this with you and with a whole wide variety of audiences during this time. The first thing that I would like to start with is talk a little bit about the situation that we're all experiencing and why we're struggling right now. A series of surveys that was conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention early in this pandemic found that more than 40% of Americans had at least one mental health condition that they said was linked to the pandemic. That was done a little while ago, so this number is likely higher now. So well beyond the infectious disease risk of COVID, there's a mental health risk. This has been referred to as the third wave of the pandemic by some, following a physical wave and an economic fallout. There is also evidence that the wave is affecting some, such as those experiencing financial struggle, more than others. Americans are also now experiencing the highest levels of stress since April 22, based on a national poll done by the American Psychological Association. Half of those who are surveyed feel uneasy about adjusting to in-person interaction as they re-enter social circles. So now that we have adjusted to being alone, we have to do another adjustment to figure out what is our new way of being. So this is an important time to understand and maintain our mental well-being. This data comes from a National Household Pulse survey, which shows the parallel experiences of COVID outbreaks and reports of anxiety and depression. The pandemic has been called a disaster, a global disaster, and like all disasters, it's going to take us some time to recover. And COVID has systematically infected some populations more than others. People of color have experienced particularly high physical and mental health toll as a result of the pandemic. These are the death rates among different racial groups. Because people in these communities have limited access to healthcare and financial resources and greater exposure to the virus due to their occupation, for example, frontline workers, essential workers, critical infrastructure workers, and also housing conditions that may contribute to higher levels. They have experienced more sickness, more hospitalizations, and more deaths. So what are the challenges that this situation leaves us all with? I'd like to take a few moments to name those challenges, and we'll begin with ambiguous loss, which is a term coined by Dr. Pauline Boss, a faculty member in Family Social Science at the University of Minnesota. The definition of ambiguous loss is that it's a loss that remains unclear and full of uncertainty. We don't know all the facts. So when will we contract COVID? How effective is my vaccine? How effective are booster shots? When will we get them? How should I re-enter if I've been isolated during this past time? Also with ambiguous loss, the future is unknown. We have questions like when and if this pandemic will end, how our economy will fare, how our children and the next generation will be affected. The situation can't be clarified or cured or fixed. We have things we can do to manage this pandemic, and we're all doing them, but we can't make it go away. It's not within our power. The losses can be physical or psychological or both, and we have many types of losses this year. There are financial losses, family and community loss. We're not spending time with people as we did. Loss of rituals and routines. These are things that give us structure and engagement with the world, and we've not been able to do them. A loss of trust. The world is not predictable like it might have been before. Loss of control over our daily schedules. Freedom loss, loss of safety. Significant losses, of course, of sickness and death. And even then, we have the loss of not being able to be with people and mourn in the ways that we typically would. So as Dr. Pauline Boss says, naming the problem of ambiguous loss helps people understand that the stressor is not only the virus, but it's also all these losses that go along with it. We're also experiencing isolation and loneliness. Social isolation is having few relationships or infrequent social contact with other people. Loneliness is feeling alone regardless of your level of social contact. And they can co-occur, but they don't always. The National Academy on Science, Engineering, and Medicine declared social isolation a major public health concern before this pandemic even started. And the number of people feeling lonely has increased in the last 18 months. In the United States, younger generations actually are now reporting more loneliness than older generations, maybe partly due to living alone, maybe partly due to technology use, but it's a concerning trend. Isolation and loneliness affect our mental health, depression, anxiety, suicidality, and sleep. And also, isolation and loneliness affects our physical health, things like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, your immune system, our cognitive health, general cognitive functioning, dementia, and Alzheimer's are all related to loneliness, and our economic health. People who are lonely have more medical spending, lower productivity, and more absenteeism. And many of these have worsened during this time of COVID. So I might recommend to think about your level of loneliness on a scale of 1 to 10 at the beginning of this pandemic and now. How has this changed for you? In a few minutes, we're going to get on to some strategies to take care of yourself. But I think to kind of ground yourself in what do I need? What should I be focusing on? It's helpful to be honest with ourselves about what we're experiencing during this time. Also, we are experiencing grief, which is a feeling of sorrow or suffering or distress. It's usually based on a significant loss. Anticipatory grief happens when we don't know the outcome, kind of like ambiguous loss, and that's the case with this pandemic. So we're feeling grief associated with all of those losses that I just mentioned. And then in the interest of naming our experiences, I'd also like to talk a little bit about trauma. Some have called the COVID pandemic a global communal trauma. First, a person experiences trauma when they are subject to or witness injury or threat of injury. The injury can be physical or psychological or both. Traumatic events are defined not only by the nature of the event, but also by the person's perception of it as overwhelming. This pandemic is, of course, overwhelming and traumatic. I've heard the word overwhelming so much in the last year and a half in all kinds of settings. The threat of sickness has been widespread, and that remains as we experience the Delta variant now. And as a population, we are experiencing trauma due to exposed racism and related struggles and injuries and deaths. This picture on the left is of George Floyd Square. We are now witnessing killings like his via video in ways that we hadn't before. And these traumatic events have contributed to a decreased sense of safety, of course, for many in the African American community, but for everyone. And safety is a critical part of mental well-being. We can't be mentally well if we don't feel safe. And then finally, about our challenges, picture yourself in this crowd. If this idea makes your stomach turn a little bit or your heart beat a little faster, like it does for me, you might be experiencing a little bit of COVID transition anxiety. This is obviously at the state fair, and I might actually experience anxiety on any year in a crowd like this, but certainly at this time when I've been isolating for a long time and associate that with being safe. So we now have the stage of reentry where we need to decide how and when to resume our normal activities with others in the world. And for some, this stage is particularly anxiety producing. Our bodies and our brains adjusted to that year of isolation and pandemic living. And we need to figure out now how to tend to our well-being. And it's a particularly important time to do that. So I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into exactly what that means, well-being. This is a model created by Dr. Corey Keyes at Emory University. And we used to think about mental health and mental illness as the same thing, or maybe as opposite ends of a spectrum. He was the first person who separated mental health from mental illness and realized that they're actually on two different spectra. So this is called the dual continuum model. It shows illness on the horizontal axis. So severe mental illness on the left and no mental illness on the right. And it shows functioning on the vertical axis, poor mental health functioning on the bottom, and optimal mental health functioning on the top. And I really like this because for many, it adjusts our way of thinking about mental health and well-being. What it does is it divides the population into 4 quadrants, and these are not set in stone for our lives, which is one thing that we sometimes thought too with mental health diagnoses. People in the first quadrant have good mental health and no mental illness, and we call that flourishing. People in quadrant 2 have severe stress on their mental health with no mental illness, and we call that languishing. People in quadrant 3 have severe stress on their mental health with a mental illness, languishing, and mental illness. And then people in quadrant 4 have good mental health with a mental illness. So they're flourishing in spite of the fact that they have a mental illness. And so what this does is it reminds us that a person can experience significant struggle without illness. Those are the people in quadrant 2. Or they can experience good mental health with illness. Those are the folks in quadrant 4. And it also introduces the idea of mental flourishing, which is the top half. So what I'm talking about today is helping people move up. How do we help people flourish regardless of their diagnosis? I'm a public health educator. I'm not a clinician. So it's really important that we have clinicians who are helping people manage illness. And often we relegate this whole field actually to those who are here to treat illness. But so many more of us can help promote mental wellness. So I'm helping individuals, families, organizations, communities flourish. So another thing I might recommend too is that you think about where in this model you fall right now, and remember that that's temporary. And think maybe about how that dot representing you has moved in the past year. Are you flourishing? Are you languishing? Has it moved for you? Is it moving around still during the stage of reentry? I will move on to the next slide and talk a little bit more about flourishing. So if we're going to help people move up, we have to know when we're successful. And there are several measures of mental well-being now. And I will show you a quick overview of a scale by Dr. Keyes, the same person who created that dual continuum. To flourish requires both positive emotions and positive functioning. These are the things that pull us into a healthy and engaged life. I will describe them, and I'll invite you here too to identify a couple that are present in your life and perhaps a couple that aren't that you could work on. First, to flourish, you need an emotional component, which means feeling well. It means you mostly feel happy, calm, satisfied with your life, mostly interested in your life. You need a psychological component, which is related to how we function as an individual. You have positive and warm relationships. You like yourself and your personality, which means you have self-acceptance. You have a sense of identity and purpose. You believe that your life has meaning. You strive for personal growth. You're able to adapt your environment to meet your needs. And you have a sense of direction or autonomy. And then you also need a social component. This is particularly relevant this past year and right now, and it's one that's often forgotten. This is how we function with others. Here, to be mental flourishing and to have this social component, you believe that people accept and care about one another. You believe that society is improving for people like you, or social actualization. You have a sense of community or connectedness. You contribute to society and you believe that your contribution is useful. You find engagement with people meaningful or have a sense of social coherence. And according to the scale, we need one emotional component and 6 either psychological or social components. We don't need all of them. We're not aiming for perfection, but this scale was actually based on the scale for depression and kind of flipped. So a certain number of these are needed to fit into that category of mental flourishing. So given this definition, we can do more than help people manage illness. We can do a whole lot to promote wellness. And here, according to Dr. Keyes, a small percentage of us experience depression. That's the part that's often visible to others. A lot more of us are not flourishing or are languishing. And that's concerning not only because languishing leads to depression, it can lead to depression, but also because of the missed potential. As the Surgeon General here in the United States said, I think over a decade ago, there is no health without mental health. We have to do more to prevent illness and to help people flourish. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about self-care. And I just want to note that not all self-care practices work for all people. In Extension, we're creating a toolkit for people to choose from, for educators actually to use in their classes and to choose from based on their participants and the mood of the class and their conversation. What I hope is that you can find here a combination of activities that fit in your life and have meaning for you. So I'll present a menu of self-care activities and keep in mind what might work for you. So these are based on what we know about mental well-being, stress, trauma, and resilience. First, accept so-called negative feelings that we have: anxiety, worry, fear, boredom, loneliness, grief, anger, as they come. And know that they're completely normal responses to stressful situations. Often, sometimes, myself included, we try to focus on them and think them away. And if we can accept them, they pass often. So if we can take things as they come, that's the first thing. Another thing, shift your expectations for yourself, your children, your family members, your colleagues. This has not been business as usual, as we know, and we all have different needs during this time, and our needs keep changing too. Remember that isolation is temporary. We can take one day at a time if we're in an isolated environment now. Sometimes when I've been in my house too long with my teenage sons, I have to take 1 hour at a time. Look for beauty outside your window, in your family members, in other people that you see, in animals, in the objects around you. Practice mindful breathing. Stress can lead to shallow breathing and an increased heart rate. It engages our sympathetic nervous system. And if you can purposefully engage your parasympathetic nervous system, you can counteract that stress. So slow, deep breathing. I can provide links or examples of different types of breathing if you're interested. Practice grounding yourself. In times of acute stress, this is particularly helpful. For example, one method is you can be still and notice 5 things you see around you, wherever you are, 4 things you feel, 3 things you hear, 2 things you smell, and 1 thing you taste. And these actions can help orient you to the present moment in times of stress. Take care of your body, sleep and rest. Getting enough sleep is really important in strengthening the immune system. Stay hydrated, eat well, move and exercise as you're able. I take daily walks, sometimes twice daily, and that's been really my best self-care practice during this time. Keep a daily schedule. Many of us have adjusted to this during this past year. Initially at the time of the pandemic, when it began, we really needed to teach ourselves, how do I do all of my days when I'm spending them at home with time for sleep and meals and exercise and self-care and work? Figuring that out gives us a sense of security and predictability. And then keep a gratitude list. There is research around this, and writing down what we are grateful for supports an optimistic perspective and our overall reports of mental well-being. Gratitude is associated with physical and psychological health and increased happiness and life satisfaction. More grateful people are happier and more satisfied with their lives and less materialistic and less likely to suffer from burnout. So I actually have a activity that I bring to events if we're doing them in person, where I ask people to identify things they're grateful for, write them down, pass out gratitude quotes. We have a whole little tiny mini curriculum around this. In one study, the more grateful cardiac patients reported better sleep, less fatigue, and lower levels of cellular inflammation. So I can't overstate the importance of remembering what you're grateful for. Meditate. This helps you train you to focus and be aware of the present moment, and it also promotes emotional calm. I would really recommend that you find small things to do regularly. This makes it more possible to incorporate them into our daily lives. For example, spend 1 minute thinking about something you're grateful for, rather than aiming for an hour of silent meditation or something really long and unmanageable. Very small things make a difference. Control your news narrative. Ask yourself what information you want to take into your mind and your thoughts. What's helpful to you now? Choose what's most meaningful, not what happens to appear in front of you. Choose reputable sources of information and limit your consumption of that. And pay attention to how information that you're taking in affects your stress levels. Remember the activities you enjoy and do more of them. Give yourself permission. Read, write, listen to music, make music, exercise, call loved ones, paint, garden, cook, all do athletic activities. I know a lot of people during this time have been learning new skills. Those all help promote our mental wellness. Connect with others, really important. Our healing actually happens in relationship with others often. So we can use this great technology we have to reach out to families and friends and neighbors. Communicate carefully. particularly during times of stress. Sometimes all the things we've learned about communication kind of fly out of our head. And so pay attention to how you speak and listen to others, particularly during those times of stress, or if you're spending more time with family members inside your homes. In general, speak carefully, listen attentively, and respond accurately, and recognize that everyone responds to stress differently. Join online activities, particularly relevant during this time, and for many going forward, if they're still isolated. Think about isolation as an opportunity for solitude. Look for ways that being alone helps you reflect and recharge. Laughter really is good medicine. I take time to share jokes and stories and photos with my family members. We've also created some silly new routines during the pandemic that involve puppets and cards and our new pandemic puppy. Take the long view during times of stress. Ask yourself, who do I want to be on the other side of this crisis? And how does that guide my behavior now? And then finally, be a role model to others with your own self-care. We all need to take care of ourselves better. And I'd love to shift our culture to place more value on this. And I think the more we all serve as role models, the easier that will be for everyone. So far, up till this point, we've been talking about individual functioning, but our mental well-being doesn't depend solely on an individual factors. And so this comes from Leah's Pantry, which is a nutrition education program, and it reflects the need to create trauma-informed systems and environments. And it's important to us because of how using this trauma-informed lens as we manage this pandemic to helps us heal. And also it reflects how self-care happens within the context of other needs, warm and trusting relationships and healing communities. So a little bit about this. First, supporting your authentic self is not about perfection. It's not even about engaging in therapy, although it could be for some, but it's about promoting those three areas of mental flourishing: emotional, psychological, and social. So you can begin by reflecting on where you are and what you need. This varies from person to person, depending on their situation and their interests. What's important is to value self-care, to set an intention and set aside time to practice it. Second, that all happens within the context of compassionate relationships. Healing happens in this context. And I've been talking a lot about self-care, but I could use the term collective care, which invites all of us to take responsibility for the mental health of everyone else, and recognizes that term collective care recognizes that what's good for the group is good for the individual. And in fact, an individual's mental well-being is linked to the mental well-being of others. So caring for ourselves is a shared responsibility. It's not the lone task of an individual. And then finally, healing communities. These first two can help us create healing communities that we all need. Whole communities can work together toward healing too. So we can also start at a community level and create communities that support compassionate relationships and authentic individuals. And this slide is actually a handout that I'm happy to share with you in case you need a reminder of some of these activities and how they kind of support our components of mental flourishing and help us move up on that scale. This next slide I know is difficult to read, and so Aaliyah is going to put that in the chat so that you can find where that is online. And Aaliyah, if you don't have that link, I'm happy to do that too. But I will tell you a little bit about it. There we go. And this is my last slide. This is a bigger picture of mental well-being within a societal context. This is an ecological model which shows the levels of influence in a person's life. The person is influenced by factors at all of these levels. So relationships, organizations, society, community, policy. And it shows that we tend to overfocus on individual when we think about mental health, when we think about mental illness, and when we think about mental health and well-being. And our mental health is affected by individual factors, things like biology and life experience and stress response. It's also influenced by our relationships, our home environment, our social support, our organizations that we participate in, schools, employers, their environments. Are they supportive? Are they stigmatizing? Communities, housing and neighborhoods. Is your housing overcrowded? Is your neighborhood welcoming to you? Policies, are the policies in place that support your mental well-being? What about your mental illness treatment? Are you able to manage that? Can you manage your mental health needs? And society, large issues like social conflict and migration, racism, oppression, poverty, war. This is a work in progress, but there was a group of us at the university and at the state health department that realized that we hadn't really presented mental well-being in this ecological framework. And we wanted to visually show the many, many areas of mental health. So it points out not only the breadth of research on mental well-being, and this is just a starting point, but also that there's many points of intervention, no matter what our role or setting. So that is my last slide. This is just, I'd like to share one of my favorite self-care practices from this past year and a half. This is hiking with my family, which we did most weekends as a foursome, as often as we were able. And I encourage you to make a list of what activities work for you and shift your time as you're able in order to incorporate them into your daily life. That is the end of my presentation. I am happy to take questions or move on to whatever works for you next.
Thank you so much, Carrie Michaels. That was really fantastic. I wanted to go ahead now and move on to the Q&A because I think I will tell you, I was actually messaging with some of my colleagues during this talk, and just so much of the things you were saying sounded really familiar and really resonated, I think, at least with my experience and some of my colleagues. To all of you who are on the call, I do want to let you know that you can go ahead and chat your questions right into the chat box. Oh, thank you for dropping that in. And I will also drop the mental flourishing handout in just a moment. I overestimated my ability to run a slideshow while dropping a link in. So I will get that PDF of the mental flourishing handout in just a moment. But I actually do have a question from a colleague that I think will be meaningful to a lot of people on this call, and it's regarding self-care. So I think a lot of people are just feeling kind of depleted and burned out at this point, especially with the fact that we just don't know what's coming. So can you talk a little bit about how people can kind of move from feeling burned out to practicing self-care?
Yes, I understand that feeling of burnout. I share that feeling of burnout. And I think that sometimes if we haven't spent time thinking about mental well-being, it can be an overwhelming thought. And I think starting out small is the best thing I have to say for that. Tiny, tiny things can add up. So I wasn't doing a very good job of this when the pandemic started. And then actually that list of self-care activities I wrote because I needed it, kind of. I mean, I was doing research about it, but I felt like other people needed it too. So I started talking about it and I started making really, really small shifts. And so, for example, the hikes that I do that grounding exercise of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 somewhat regularly. I have, now this is just getting into small things, but I have lavender on a Kleenex sitting right in front of me so that when I do that grounding exercise, one of the things I smell is lavender. I also work on the task of noticing beauty. So I can fall into, what do I have to do? What do I have to do? What's next? When is it due? A lot. And I can be that person who says, oh, in 2 weeks, everything will slow down. And then I do that all my life. So I can have a really a pattern of thinking that can create stress. And so my best recommendation really is to start very, very small things. I don't know that I have the best answer on overcoming burnout entirely, because I feel like it's been an ongoing task for me. the demand for this content shot up when the pandemic started. So there's been a lot, but I do feel like I rely on those very, very small and regular activities that I do for my own self-care.
That's a great answer. And it does seem like on some level it's personal and finding what works for you, but some good ideas for people to work with. So I have another question here. I think this one will have a lot of relevance to people too. In this era of divisive politics and medical decision-making, do you have recommendations on how to maintain compassionate relationships with those who've been traditionally part of your network, but are now making decisions you just can't support?
It's an excellent question, and I am not the expert on this. What I remember when I think about, okay, so what have I been just talking about and how can I apply that, is people respond to stress so differently. And I try to at least have some grace around the fact that we are all very different people. And when presented with a crisis as big as a worldwide pandemic, we're going to go to our corners. We're going to go to what's comfortable. And I know that that's not a sufficient answer to that question, but it's at least a starting point for me.
So just kind of understanding your feelings before you engage with those individuals.
And also understanding that they had a different reaction than I did. I don't understand it. I don't know where it came from, but it's different from mine. Mm-hmm. And there's probably a reason they went to that place.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Then finally, this question from Carrie Dwyer. How does grounding work? I feel like stress causes me to kick into trying to address it. And how can we help ourselves, I think, understand why we need to slow down to get grounded?
Sure. I know that sometimes when people suggest, oh, you should do this for anxiety, or you should do that for stress, I feel like it's another thing on my to-do list, and it doesn't help. Grounding for me, and what I read about it, is really what I do in the present moment when I feel that stress mounting or I feel more acute stress. So it's not about anything in my head. It's actually about engaging all of your senses in the present moment. And I'm not going to do this justice either, but one of my colleagues talks more about the brain and body functions. And when you turn on that parasympathetic nervous system, the other stress responses have to shut down. So if you can do it, then you're essentially shutting down the things that are causing stress in your body. So for me, the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is a really good one. Another one is taking a walk and just noticing one thing, like deciding I'm going to walk around my block and just look at the trees. I'm not going to look at anything else. I'm just going to notice the trees, or notice the color of flowers in people's yards. And those things help me because they engage my senses in the present moment. And that's what I think grounding is about. Does that answer your question, Carrie?
Yes, thank you.
I see you're nodding. All right, I'm going to give everybody an opportunity to unmute if they want to just ask their question live. But these are some great answers to a conversation I think that a lot of us are having about just how we get where we need to be in this weird time. So as I'm pausing to see if there's any other questions, I do want to just say thank you so much to Carrie Michaels. This has been really illuminating for me. And when we were talking about this, some of you might remember we were actually planning to have Carrie do this program for us back in July. Unfortunately, Carrie wasn't feeling well and we had to postpone it. But this is an evergreen topic, and I think this is something that we're all dealing with on a daily basis. So I'm so glad we were able to reschedule. And I want to thank Carrie Michaels and Carrie Dwyer for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I also just want to share a few additional resources that we have. And I will go ahead also and drop some of these right into the chat. In particular, I wanted to highlight this article that Carrie Dwyer wrote and shared in some of our Learn from Home resources on the Science Museum's website. And I also wanted to remind everyone that we have another event coming up next month, and that'll be on October 29th. We do these every Thursday, the last Thursday of the month. And next month, we're going to be looking at Indigenous foodways. So our archaeologists have some really cool findings about Indigenous foodways in the past that they're going to share with us. And we'll also have some guests joining us to talk about what Indigenous food means today and what Indigenous foodways mean today. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation. We'll be emailing you about that very soon. And in the meantime, I want to thank all of you for joining us. We're so grateful for your commitment to bold science, fun, and lifelong learning. We do appreciate your continued support and hope to see you when you feel safe at the Science Museum of Minnesota. And until that time, I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank our presenters and our sponsors again. And I wish you a wonderful morning. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.